The first box they put me in wasn't an office, it was a glorified closet, next to the mailroom with a desk that had a wobbly leg, and a computer that took 10 minutes to boot up. The air always smelled like stale coffee and toner fluid. My job was to sort the inter-office mail, run errands for the senior associates, and basically be invisible, and I was for the most part until I wasn't. I remember the first time I had to deliver a package to Mr. Davison's office. He was a senior partner, a man whose suits cost more than my monthly rent. I knocked quietly, opened the door just enough to slide the envelope onto the corner of his desk. He was on the phone, didn't even look at me, just waved a hand to shoo me away. But as I was closing the door, I heard him say, "No, don't worry about that, just have the mailroom kid handle it." That was my title, the mailroom kid. It wasn't just a place to sleep between shifts at the office and shifts with my textbooks. It was a lonely, grueling routine. But there was a strange peace in it. This was my secret project, my silent rebellion. I couldn't get anyone to listen. I prepared a presentation filled with charts and projections. Mark listened for about 3 minutes before his phone buzzed. "Looks like you've been busy, Alex. Good for you. But we have a brand, a reputation. We're not some flash-and-thep-and startup." He left the room. That was the moment I decided to stop asking for permission. My team and I started working after hours. We were a quiet, dedicated shadow operation, using the budget from my meager department. I signed us up for online courses in data science and digital marketing. We became experts, and then we started a pilot project without telling a soul. We completely overhauled the marketing and sales approach for one of our smaller, struggling product lines. We built a new modern website for it. We ran targeted ad campaigns. We used a new agile customer relationship management system. Id found we treated it like a separate business, a startup within the aging giant. Within 6 months, that product line was our fastest growing segment. Profits were up over 300%. The non-family employees in my department, the ones who had been overlooked for years, they were electric. They saw what was possible. They saw competence being rewarded with results, not with condescension. Loyalty wasn't something I had to ask for, it was earned. Meanwhile, the old guard was baffled. They couldn't figure out why this one obscure part of the business was suddenly thriving. They chalked it up to a fluke, a lucky market trend. And the crisis hit. It wasn't a slow leak anymore, it was a rupture. Our biggest competitor, a company that had embraced the digital world, launched a direct assault. They undercut our prices by 30% and launched a marketing campaign that painted us as obsolete, out of touch. Our sales plummeted. Panic set in the quarterly strategy meetings were no longer polite. They were war rooms filled with fear. The old strategist personal calls, the loyalty discounts were useless against this new kind of competition. The company was facing layoffs. The family legacy, built over 2 generations, was about to collapse in a matter of months. I remember the emergency board meeting. The room was thick with tension. Mark was pacing, red-faced, yelling about betrayal in the marketplace. Carol was suggesting we cut advertising budgets, which was like trying to put out a fire by removing the oxygen from the room. Everyone was talking in circles, proposing variations of the same tactics that had already failed. I was sitting quietly in my usual seat in the corner. Finally, my father, who had been mostly silent, looked at me. His face was pale. "Alex," he said, his voice tired, "you've been quiet. Do you have anything to add?" I stood up. I didn't walk to the head of the table. I just stood by my chair. I had a single tablet with me. I didn't have slides, I had data. "The problem isn't our competitor," I started. My voice was calm, which seemed to surprise everyone. "The problem is us. We've been solving for the wrong equation for a decade." I pulled up the analytics from my pilot project. I showed them the growth. I showed them the customer acquisition costs, the lifetime value. I explained how we'd done it. Then I showed them the At work, I started volunteering for things, not the glamorous projects that everyone fought over, but the tedious, complicated ones that everyone else avoided. The inventory audit that required spending a week in the dusty basement archives, the migration of the old client database that was always crashing. I became the person who would say yes when everyone else said no. And in doing those jobs, I learned things. I found discrepancies in the inventory records that saved the company thousands. I figured company-wide data, the steep decline that mirrored exactly what my models had predicted 2 years earlier. Then I laid out the plan. It wasn't a suggestion, it was a comprehensive, data-driven roadmap to not only survive the attack, But to counterattack, it involved a complete digital transformation, a restructuring of our sales force, a rebranding of our core identity. It was bold, it was expensive, it was everything the old guard had feared and mocked. Mark slammed his hand on the table. Absolutely not, this is insanity. You want to gamble my father's company on some internet fad. This is why you were kept out of these meetings, Alex. You don't have the experience to understand the risk. That's when it happened. The coup wasn't loud, it was quiet and definitive. I looked at him. And then I looked at my father. The risk, I said, is continuing to do what we've always done. That path leads to bankruptcy. Within 18 months, my projections are in the file in front of you. This plan, I tapped the tablet, is the only path to survival. But it requires a single point of leadership. It requires someone to see it through without committee votes and second-guessing. The room was silent. My father looked from Mark's furious face to my calm. When he looked at the fear in the eyes of the other senior leaders, his lifelong friends, he saw the numbers on the screen, he saw the future of his life's work hanging in the balance. He took a deep breath. The board will convene in private. He said. An hour later they called me back and my father wouldn't look at me. He stared at the table. The board has voted, he said, his voice a whisper, effective immediately. You are appointed Chief Executive Officer. You have full authority to implement your plan. There was no celebration. The power wasn't sweet, it was heavy. It felt like taking the wheel of a ship in a hurricane. The first thing I did was not fire anyone. I called a company-wide meeting. I stood in front of everyone, the family, the employees who had watched the drama for years. I acknowledged the fear. I laid out the challenge with brutal honesty. And then I laid out the plan. I gave credit to my team, the analysts who had worked in the shadows with me. I asked for everyone's help. I asked them to trust me. The transformation was grueling. There were days I thought we wouldn't make it, but the data was our guide. And the results started to materialize slowly. Then all at once we stopped the bleeding. Then we started to grow. Within a year, we were more profitable than we had been before the crisis. We'd secured the jobs of every single employee. We weren't just saved, we were reinvented. The formal transition of power was a quiet affair. Mark resigned to pursue other opportunities. Carol took an advisory role, which mostly involved staying away from the office. My father retired fully, finally able to rest. Now the people who once condescended to me report to me. They come into my office, the corner office, with the view of the river, and they treat me with a respect that is no longer tinged with familial obligation. It's earned. Out the flaw in the database code that the IT department had given up on. I wasn't just completing tasks. I was solving problems no one knew they had. Slowly, quietly, I was making myself indispensable. I built connections. I'd stay late to help the night security guard with a computer issue his grandson had set up. I'd chat with the cleaning staff, learning the unofficial rhythms of the building. These were the people who saw everything, who knew everything. They became my unofficial network, my eyes. And the other day Mark came to see me. He needed a reference for a new job. It was awkward. He stood there looking older. And he said, you know, all those years, I thought I was protecting Dad's legacy. I thought I was protecting you from making a mistake. I nodded. I know, I said. And I did know he wasn't a villain. He was just scared of a world he didn't understand. The thing is, Mark, I said, protecting a legacy isn't about keeping it in a museum. It's about building it anew for the next generation. That was the job all along. He didn't say anything. He just nodded and left. Knowing my place was never about staying in the warehouse. It was about understanding that my place was wherever the future of the family was being secured. The power wasn't the point. The point was the stewardship. The point was making sure the doors my father walked through at 16 were still open, stronger than ever for his grandchildren. The respect I have now isn't for the title, it's for having the courage to do what was necessary, not for myself, but for all of us. The air in that main conference room was always the same: stale coffee, the faint hum of a dozen laptops, and this buzz of performative energy. It was the annual internal hackathon, and the final presentations were about to start. I remember my palms were sweaty against the cool metal of my laptop. I'd been working on this for months in the quiet hours. After my regular tickets were closed, it wasn't just a feature. It was a new way of thinking about data synchronization, a core algorithm that could cut latency by orders of magnitude. I called it the ETHA protocol. I remember walking up to the podium, plugging in the HDMI cable. The slide deck was clean, the code examples were elegant. I started explaining the problem space, the current bottlenecks in our own infrastructure. I saw a few junior developers nodding their eyes, lighting up with that spark of recognition. They got it. But then I looked at the judges' table, the two founders Alex and Ben, where their Alex was scrolling through his phone. Ben was whispering to the lead architect Sarah. I pushed on. I got to the core innovation. The part I was most proud of. I explained how the protocol used a novel consensus mechanism to bypass the traditional handshake overhead. That's when Alex finally looked up. He didn't smile, he just tilted his head. So you're basically reinventing TCP. He said, his voice flat. We have protocols, they work. This looks like a solution in search of a problem. Sarah chimed in, leaning into the microphone. The code is interesting, she said. And the way she said interesting felt like a physical blow. But it's not production ready. It's overly complex. We need robust, simple solutions, not academic exercises. You should focus on the bug backlog for the payment module. That's where you can add real value. Ben finally spoke. It's just not our focus right now. We're optimizing for scale, not for theoretical performance gains. Stick to the roadmap. Years. The room got very quiet. The junior developers who were nodding before were now looking down at their desks. I tried to say something to defend the practicality of it, but Alex just waved a hand. Thanks for the effort, next presenter. I walked back to my seat. The rest of the presentations were a blur. A few other ideas got the same treatment. One guy proposed a new UI for the admin panel, and they loved it. They gave him a prize. I just sat there, my laptop cooling in my lap. The code was right there. It was clean, it was fast, it was everything. And they called it an academic exercise. They said it was trash. The next few weeks were unbearable. Every stand-up meeting felt like a mockery. I'd get assigned trivial bugs. Senior developers would pat me on the shoulder. Hey, don't worry about the hackathon. They'd say, we've all had ideas that didn't land, just keep your head down and ship code. It was the condescension that stung the most, the implication that I was a dreamer who didn't understand how the real world worked. I couldn't do it. I couldn't sit there and watch my work languish on a private GitHub repo while the company's own product started to creak under the weight of its own technical debt. So I quit. I gave my 2 weeks. On my last day, I made sure every line of code for the Ether protocol was on my personal machine. It was my work. I'd done it on my own time. It was mine. The first few months after leaving were quiet, scary. I moved my desk into my garage, just a folding table, a powerful desktop machine, and a whiteboard covered in equations. I lived off my savings, ramen noodles, and cheap coffee. My girlfriend at the time thought I was crazy. You had a good job, Shed. Say, why throw it all away on this idea? They didn't want. She didn't last long. The garage became my whole world. I rebuilt everything from the ground up, not just a protocol, but a full product around it. A real-time data streaming platform. I turned the Ether protocol into EtherStream. The MVP was rough, the UI was basic. But the core was brilliant. It was fast, incredibly fast. I remember the first sign of life. I posted about it on a niche developer forum, just a technical deep dive into the approach. The comments started rolling in, not just cool project, but serious questions from engineers at big tech companies. They were intrigued then. A few early adopters signed up for the beta. Their feedback was golden. They were using it for things I never even imagined: financial trading platforms, real-time collaborative editing tools. The organic growth was slow, but it was real. It was authentic. I'll never forget the day I got the first email from a venture capital firm. They'd heard about the performance metrics from one of their portfolio companies. They wanted to talk. I was sitting in my garage in my sweatpants, and I was on a Zoom call with a partner from a top-tier firm. They got it immediately. They saw the vision that led to a seed round, a small one, but enough to hire 2 engineers. We moved out of my garage and into a tiny windowless office space. It was glorious. Meanwhile, I'd keep an eye on my old company, Veridian Systems. Their product announcements became less frequent. Their blog posts started talking about refactoring legacy systems and improving platform stability. They were stuck. They were trying to scale by throwing more servers at the problem. But their fundamental architecture was flawed, the very problem my protocol solved. I'd see their engineers complaining on social media about the impossible bottlenecks. There was a certain quiet satisfaction in that. The opportunity didn't arrive with a trumpet blast. It arrived with a silent, panicked email that leaked out on a Tuesday afternoon. The subject line was urgent system-wide glitch. One of our oldest, most critical software platforms, the one that managed all our client billing, had frozen. The entire sales team was dead in the water. The IT department was scrambling. But the problem was arcane, buried in lines of code written by a contractor who'd left years ago. The higher-ups were having close door. They were feeling the pain I had tried to prevent. About 18 months after I left, my phone rang. It was an unknown number with a Palo Alto area code. I let it go to voicemail. The message was from Ben, one of the founders. His voice was strained, overly cheerful. Hey, long time, no talk. We've been following the progress of Etha Stream, really impressive stuff. We should connect, see if there's a way we can work together. I didn't call back right away. I let it sit for a week. When I finally called him, I made sure I was in our new proper office, with my small team, working diligently outside the glass. The conversation was surreal. Ben was all compliments. We always knew you were brilliant, he said. I almost laughed. He talked about synergies and strategic alignment. He finally got to the point. They wanted to acquire EthaStream. They wanted to bring the technology in-house to power their next-generation platform. The negotiation process was a masterclass in irony. They sent over their initial offer. It was low, an insultingly low number. It felt like they were still trying to put me in my place, my lawyer. And I countered with a valuation that reflected our traction, our patent portfolio, and most importantly, the fact that we were now a direct competitor, eating into their market share. The final meeting was at their headquarters. I walked back into that same building I'd left in disgrace, the same glass walls, the same espresso machine in the lobby. But this time, I wasn't heading to a cubicle. I was ushered into the main boardroom, the same room where they'd shot me down. Alex and Ben were there, along with their full C-suite. They looked tired. I sat down at the head of the table. For the first hour, it was all business term sheets, earnouts, integration timelines. Then Alex leaned back in his chair. He had this resigned look on his face. You know, he said, we didn't see it. The market wasn't there yet. I just looked at him. I didn't say anything. The silence stretched out. He was waiting for me to absolve him, to say it was okay. I didn't. Finally, I simply said the market was always there. You just chose not to look. That was the moment. The power dynamic truly shifted. The deal was signed. The number was life-changing. Coming back as the head of the new Advanced Platforms division was its own unique challenge. I had a Cleveland title. My old manager now reported to me. The engineers who had mocked my idea were now on my team. The culture at Viridian was toxic. It was built on hierarchy and fear. No one took risks. Innovation was punished. My first all-hands meeting was terrifying. I stood on the same stage where I'd been humiliated. I looked out at a sea of skeptical faces. I didn't talk about synergy or corporate values. I talked about the Etha protocol. I whiteboarded the exact same concepts I had presented at the hackathon. But this time no one interrupted. This time they were listening. Meetings, their voices tense. You could feel the fear in the air. This was going to cost the company a fortune, in lost revenue and client trust. The real work began then. It wasn't about the code anymore. The code was proven. It was about the people. I started holding office hours. Any engineer from any team could come and pitch an idea. No slides needed, just a conversation. At first no one came. Then a few brave souls showed up. I funded their skunkworks projects. I gave them autonomy. I had to fight the established leadership every step of the way. Alex and Ben resisted the cultural shift. They wanted the innovation, but they didn't want to change their command and control style. It was a long, slow battle. But we started to see results. The teams working on the new Ether-powered platform were energized. They were shipping faster. They were happy. The final vindication came about a year after the acquisition. We launched the new platform. The tech press covered it extensively. They called it a phoenix rising from the ashes of Viridian's old infrastructure. At the launch party, I was standing near the buffet. I overheard two junior engineers talking. One of them said, "It's crazy to think this started as a hackathon project that got rejected." The other one replied, "Yeah, it makes you wonder what other ideas are sitting in someone's garage, because no one here would listen." I didn't say anything. I just smiled and took a sip of my drink. The cowardice wasn't in building something new. The cowardice was in a culture that refused to look beyond its own roadmap. Innovation doesn't come from the center. It doesn't come from a committee. It comes from the edges. It comes from the quiet coder in the garage who believes in something so strongly that they're willing to bet everything on it. And sometimes the only way to make them listen is to build something so good that they have no choice but To buy it. The first day you don't even see the food, you smell it, sure, this incredible aroma of seared meat and herbs, and something sweet from the pastry section. But all you see are the bottoms of pots, burnt-in rice saucepans, with a crust of reduced sauce that feels like concrete. Your world is steam and soap suds, and the constant clattering roar of the industrial dishwasher. Your arms are wet up to your elbows, your back aches from hunching over the sink, and the heat from the machine is like a constant damp fever. The hierarchy was absolute, a military operation. At the top was the head chef, a man named Marco. He never yelled my name because he didn't know it. I was just dish pig. Or you, his voice could cut through the noise of 100 sizzling pans behind corner. Hot pan. And then directed at me, move, you're blocking the pass. Or this plate is still greasy, you idiot, do it again. It was a system designed to break you, to reinforce your place. Chef Marco enjoyed it. He'd stand over the expo line tasting a sauce and say something to the sous chef, just loud enough for me to hear. This is a kitchen, not a charity. You earn your place here. Everyone starts at the bottom, so they know their place. And the bottom was where I was for 12-14 hours a day. The pay was a joke, barely enough for rent, and a bag of rice and beans to live on. But the dream was just on the other side of that stainless steel counter, the sound of a sharp knife hitting a cutting board, the sizzle of a scallop hitting a hot pan. That was the music I wanted to play. I watched from my little closet, listening to the panic, and I realized I'd seen this before, not the exact same error, but something similar. A year earlier, I'd volunteered to help clean up the digital storage for the retired projects. It was a nightmare job, sorting through terabytes of ancient files. But I'd come across the documentation for this very system, including a troubleshooting guide for rare cascade failures. I'd read it out of sheer boredom one night. I remembered the solution. It was a So I stole time after my shift ended. When everyone was gone, I'd stay. I'd take the vegetable trimmings they were going to throw out, the carrot tops, the onion ends, the outer leaves of cabbage, and I'd practice. My knife skills were terrible at first, uneven cuts, clumsy grips. But I watched the line cooks. I saw how they held their knives, the fluid motion of their wrists. I'd mimic them in the empty kitchen. The only sound, the thump of my knife on a cutting board. At 2 in the morning, I'd stare at the recipe cards, pinned up, memorizing combinations, trying to understand why they reduced a sauce by half, why they rested a steak. This was my real education, not in the heat of service, but in the quiet, lonely aftermath. The break came on a Friday night, the busiest night of the week. The prep cook, a guy named Leo, called in sick, probably fired, more like the kitchen was already in the weeds, tickets piling up on the pass. Chef Marco was screaming, his face red. They needed someone to chop myrepoix, onions, carrots, celery for the stocks and sauces, mountains of it. He looked around the chaotic kitchen, his eyes wild. And they landed on me, arms deep, in a sink full of filthy pans. You barked, wash your hands, get over here. My heart was hammering in my chest. This was it. I dried my hands on my apron, walked over to the prep station. He shoved a knife into my hand and pointed to a sack of onions, small, dice fast. And if you cry, I'll send you back to the dishes. I took a deep breath. I thought of all those late nights, all the practice. I picked up an onion, sliced it in half, peeled it. And then I started cutting. It wasn't graceful, but it was fast. And it was precise. The dice were even, perfect little squares. I moved through the onions, then the carrots, then the celery. I filled a huge tub in half the time it usually took Leo. I didn't look up. I just worked. I felt Chef Marco watching me. He didn't say anything. He just grunted, took the tub, and walked away. But the next week, my schedule changed. I was still on dishes for half the shift, but the other half I was on prep. That was the crack in the door. I pushed it open with everything I had. I outworked everyone. If the Gardemanger station needed help with salads and cold appetizers, I was there. I learned how to build a perfect salad, how to balance acidity and fat in a vinaigrette. When the sauté station was getting slammed, I'd jump in and start cooking off the pasta, searing the chicken. I learned the feel of a pan, the sound of food that's properly cooked. I mastered the grill, understanding the different heats for a rare steak versus a well-done burger. I absorbed every station, every technique. The resistance was always there, mostly from Marco. He'd find fault where there was none. Your sear is weak, he'd say, even when the scallops were perfectly caramelized. This seasoning is amateur. It was a power game. He needed to feel superior. But the other cooks, they started to respect me. They saw the work ethic. They saw the passion. Through it all, I kept a secret, a small grease-stained notebook. In it, I wrote down everything, not just Marco's recipes, but my own ideas, flavor combinations. I dreamed up dishes I thought would work better, a vision for a different kind of restaurant, a place where the kitchen wasn't run on fear, but on respect, and a shared desire for excellence. That notebook was my real goal. It was the blueprint for my future. The downfall of Marco's restaurant was slow, but inevitable. He was stuck in the past. His menu hadn't changed in years, the food was still good technically, but it was boring. The city's dining scene had evolved. But Marco hadn't. He was arrogant, blaming the customers for not having sophisticated palates. The reviews started to turn, the regulars stopped coming as often, the place was bleeding money. I saw it happening from my position. As sous chef, Id tried to suggest changes, little things. Chef, what if we did a special using some local produce? The farmer's market has amazing heirloom tomatoes right now. He'd just scoff. We are not a trendy bistro, we have standards. Counterintuitive series of commands, a workaround that wasn't in any standard manual. Then came the news: the owner, a silent partner, who never came and wanted out, he was putting the restaurant up for sale. If no one bought it, it would close. Marco tried to put together a bid, but his reputation and the declining business meant no bank would touch him. This was my moment. That notebook wasn't just a dream anymore, it was a business plan. I went to a regular, a woman named Susan, who had been coming for years. She always asked for me, loved the dishes. It'd occasionally sneak onto the menu as specials. I sat down with her, showed her the notebook, laid out my vision. I was honest. I told her about the grind, about starting in the dish pit. She saw the passion, she believed in it, she became my investor. The day we signed the papers, I walked into the empty restaurant. Marco was there, clearing out his office. He looked defeated, older than I'd ever seen him. He looked at me, and for the first time, there was no anger in his eyes, just a kind of weary resignation. So it's yours, he said. It wasn't a question. I just nodded. He shook his head and walked out, and I was alone in the space that had been my entire world for so long. But it wasn't his world anymore, it was mine. The opening was a complete transformation. We stripped the old dark wallpaper and painted the walls a bright clean white. We opened up the kitchen so customers could see the action. But the biggest change was the culture. I held a meeting with the staff. I hired a mix of a few old faces who believed in the new vision and some fresh, talented kids. I told them this kitchen runs on mutual respect. We will be demanding, we will strive for excellence in every plate, but we will also mentor, we will teach. There will be no screaming, no humiliation. You earn your place here through hard work and skill, not through fear. You could feel the difference in the air. It was focused, but it was calm, it was productive. About a month after we opened, Marco came to the door. He stood outside for a long time looking in. Finally, he came in and asked to speak to me. He was awkward, shuffling his feet. I need a job, he said, not meeting my eyes. I can still cook. I had him audition right there. During prep, I gave him a station and some ingredients. The old skill was still there, the muscle memory. His knife work was flawless. But his attitude, it was different, humbled. He worked quietly, efficiently. He didn't try to boss anyone around, he just did the work. I had a choice to make. I could turn him away, give him a taste of his own medicine, but that would have made me just like him. This new kitchen wasn't about the past. It was about the food and the team. I hired him as a line cook. It was a strange feeling seeing him on the line, taking direction from me, from the young sous chef I'd promoted. But he did it. He kept his head down and worked. And the final piece of the puzzle, the one that really brought it all full circle, was the new dishwasher, a young kid, maybe 18, quiet, eager on his first day. I saw him staring at the line cooks the same way I used to after the shift. I found him in the kitchen, practicing his knife skills on some leftover vegetables. I walked over to him. He flinched like he was expecting to be yelled at. I just smiled. Your grip is a little off, I said. Here, let me show you. And I stood next to him, guiding his hand on the knife, just like I wished someone had done for me. The circle was complete. The dream was no longer just mine. It was something I could now pass on. My heart was hammering against my ribs. This was it, the moment of visibility. I took a deep breath, opened a new email, and addressed it to the head of IT, carbon copying my direct boss, Brenda. And on a wild impulse, Mr. Davison himself. I kept the tone respectful, professional. I didn't claim to be an expert. I simply wrote that while organizing the archives, I had encountered documentation that might be relevant to the current issue. I outlined the steps from memory, attaching a scanned copy of them. Coming back to this town felt like stepping into a photograph that had started to fade. The same old brick buildings on Main Street, the same slow-moving traffic, the same faces watching from the same porches. I'd been gone for 10 years, off to college, and then working in the city, But the moment I drove back and it was like I'd never left, and they all remembered me, not the person I'd become, but the kid I used to be, the quiet one, the dreamer. I had ideas, big ones. I'd bought my grandfather's old place, the little farm on the edge of town, that had mostly gone to seed. I saw something else there. I saw a future, not in growing endless rows of corn and soybeans like everyone else, but in something different: specialty crops, heirloom vegetables, a community-supported agriculture program, maybe even a small farm-to-table market, right on the property. The first time I mentioned it down at the diner, you could have heard a pin drop. Old man Henderson just stared at me over his coffee cup. Then, he chuckled, this dry, rattling sound: heirloom tomatoes. He said loud enough for the whole counter to hear. Boy, you're gonna try and sell people funny-looking tomatoes? That's not how we do things here. That phrase became the soundtrack to my first year back. That's not how we do things here. It was a wall I kept running into. The worst of them were the Millers. They owned the biggest farm in the county, a sprawling operation that had been in their family for generations. Their son Dave had been the high school bully, and nothing had changed. He'd see me at the feed store and just shake his head. Heard you're plowin' under good pasture to plant purple carrots. He'd say, his voice dripping with mockery, gonna be a regular artiste out there. Let us know how that works out when you're bankrupt. His dad, Bill Miller, was quieter, but his disapproval was heavier. He'd just look at me with this pitying expression, like I was a simpleton who'd lost his way. The skepticism wasn't just talk. I'd find my fence lines, cut my orders for seedlings, would get mysteriously lost at the local coop. When I tried to get a loan from the town's only bank to build the market stand, the manager, who played golf with Bill Miller every weekend, turned me down flat. Too risky. He said the town's economy is built on traditional farming. We can't support a niche operation. They wanted me to fail. They wanted to prove that you couldn't bring new ideas into this place, that you had to do things their way, or you didn't belong at all. But I had a secret weapon. It was just me, my dog, and a stubbornness that ran deeper than their ridicule. I stopped trying to convince them. I stopped going to the diner for a while. I just put my head down and worked. The soil was tired from years of the same crops. So I started composting on a scale nobody around here had seen. I built greenhouses from salvaged materials. I focused on quality, on flavor. I'd spend hours in the field just tending to each plant. And slowly, quietly, I started to build a following. Not in town at first. I bypassed them completely. I built a simple website, started an Instagram account showing the progress of the farm. I sold my first boxes of produce to restaurants in the city, an hour's drive away. They loved it. They loved the story, the quality, the fact that it was all grown with such care. Then a few of the younger families in town, the ones who'd moved here, recently started seeking me out. They'd come to the farm on Saturdays and we'd talk. They wanted this. They wanted something real, something connected. Guide I'd found. That's when the rumors really started. Dave Miller would drive by slowly in his big truck, shouting something about hippie nonsense. They said I was using chemicals, that my food wasn't safe. It was pathetic, really. But it stung. There were nights I'd lie awake wondering if they were right, if I was just a fool on a hill, pretending to be a farmer. What kept me going was that small group of people, the young family who bought a share of the harvest every week, the retired schoolteacher who loved my weird varieties of squash. They became my community. They'd help with the harvest. Sometimes their kids, running through the rows of sunflowers. They showed me that this town could change, that it wasn't just the set of grumpy old men at the diner. There was a heartbeat here, a new one, and it was getting stronger. Then the news started to trickle out. It was whispers at first. Miller Farms was in trouble, not just a bad year trouble, but deep structural trouble. They'd bet everything on commodity prices staying high, and they'd crashed. They'd refused to diversify, refused to even consider that the world was changing. They were leveraged to the hilt, and the bank was calling in their loans. The pillar of the community, the family that had embodied how we do things here, was about to collapse. The day the auction notice went up in the post office, the whole town felt different. It was a quiet shock. People didn't know what to say. Miller Farms wasn't just a business. It was an institution. Its failure felt like a failure for the whole town. For me, it was complicated. I didn't feel happy. I felt a cold sense of inevitability. And I felt a strange power stirring in me. My little niche operation was thriving. My business with the city restaurants was solid. My community-supported program waiting list. I had the capital. I was in a position to acquire their land, the very land they told me I'd never be worthy of. The day of the auction was held right there on their front lawn. It was a gray, drizzly afternoon. Half the town was there not to bid, but to watch the end of an era. Bill Miller stood on the porch, his face like stone. Dave was nowhere to be seen. I stood at the back of the crowd, my heart pounding in my ears. I could feel people looking at me. They knew I had the means. The auctioneer started on the parcels. The first few went to a big agricultural corporation from out of state. Then he got to the home place, the original 200 acres with the house. And the barns. There was a long silence. No one from out of town wanted the buildings. The corporation already had its land. I heard my own voice before I even realized I'd decided to speak. I named a figure. It was fair. It was more than fair. Every head turned. Bill Miller looked up from the porch steps. And for the first time he really saw me. There was no anger in his eyes, just a hollow-out defeat. The auctioneer called it once, twice. And then his gavel fell just like that. I owned the farm of the family that had told me I'd never be anything. The power I felt in that moment was intoxicating. I could have sold off their equipment. I could have torn down their barn. I could have marched up to Bill Miller and said something petty and triumphant. The old hurt wanted me to. But as I stood there looking at that proud old house, at the land that had been in his family for over a century, I didn't see an enemy. I saw a legacy broken and lying in pieces. And I saw an opportunity that was bigger than revenge. I didn't fire the farmhands. Most of them had worked for the Millers for decades. I called a meeting in the big barn the next week. They stood there nervous, unsure what this new young boss with his strange ideas would do. I told them their jobs were safe. I told them I needed their experience. But I also told them things were going to change. We were going to diversify. We were going to try new things. Some of them were skeptical, but they stayed. They had families to feed. Description: it was a designation, a box I was supposed to stay in. The silence after I hit send was louder than any noise. For 10 minutes nothing. Then my phone rang. It was Brenda. Her voice was sharp, unnerved. What is this? Why are you emailing the partners? This is far outside your purview. Before I could even answer, I got a call on the other line. It was the head of IT. Is this the mailroom? He asked, his voice breathless. The fix worked. The system is back online. Who are you? A week later, Dave Miller showed up at my door. He looked smaller than I remembered. He asked if there was any work. He couldn't look me in the eye. I could have turned him away. God, a part of me wanted to. But I hired him. I put him in charge of the traditional grain operation. It was what he knew. I treated him with the same respect I treated everyone else. No special favors. No grudges, just fairness. The first time I corrected him on something, I saw the old defiance flash in his eyes. But it died. Just as quickly. He just nodded and said, "Okay, boss." That word boss, it was a strange feeling. The real turning point was with his father. Bill Miller became a recluse. He'd still come to the diner, but he'd sit alone. One afternoon, I saw him walking the fence line between our properties, looking out over the fields that were now mine. I went out to meet him. We stood there for a minute in silence. Then I told him about my plans for the old Miller land. I was going to convert a section to organic pasture for grass-fed beef. I was going to restore the old orchard. I wasn't erasing his history. I was building a new one on top of it. I asked him if he wanted to consult, to share his knowledge of the land. I saw his shoulders loosen just a little. He didn't say yes, but he didn't say no. He just gave a slow nod. It was a start. Now the farm isn't mine. Not really. It's the town's farm again. The market stand I built is bustling on weekends. People come from 3 counties over. We employ twice as many people as the Millers did at the end. We host school trips. We've become a destination. And the old guard, the ones who said that's not how we do things here, they still come around. They buy my heirloom tomatoes. They were a little grudging at first, but they come because the truth is progress isn't about destroying the past. It's about building a new future that's strong enough to hold both. I didn't win by beating them. I won by building something they eventually wanted to be a part of. And in doing that, this town, my hometown, finally started to feel like home. The first thing you learn is the sound of your own voice being ignored. It has a specific tone to it. It's not that they talk over you, not always. Sometimes it's worse. They let you finish your sentence. There's a polite nod, a non-committal hum, and then the conversation just pivots as if you'd made a sound, not a point. I'd sit in those glass-walled conference rooms, the air thick with the smell of stale coffee and ambition, and present a solution to a problem we'd been wrestling with for weeks. A clean, elegant solution. Silence. A few seconds later, Mark from engineering would say, "What if we tried this?" and paraphrase my idea almost word for word, and the room would light up. "Brilliant, Mark, now we're getting somewhere." And you just sit there, a smile plastered on your face, your pen poised over the notebook they all assume is for taking their notes. The microaggressions were the daily wallpaper, sweetheart. Can you grab the coffee from a man younger than me being introduced as one of our bright young things? Instead of the lead analyst, the managing partner Charles once pulled me aside after a presentation. He put a fatherly hand on my shoulder and said, "You have fantastic instincts. But remember, sometimes the smartest play is to know your place, be a team player. The loudest voice isn't always the most respected." He meant it as kindness. He was advising me to be less me, to shrink, to make myself palatable. And the worst part, for a while, I tried it. I softened my language. I prefaced every suggestion with, "This might be a silly idea." But I made the coffee and the burning in my chest, the sheer unadulterated need to prove every single one of them wrong, that became my fuel. I worked later. I dug deeper. I stopped seeing my quiet fury as a liability and started treating it as my most valuable asset. The confrontation happened an hour later. I was called into a conference room. Mr. Davison was there, along with the IT director. And Brenda, she sat with her arms crossed, her lips a thin line. Mr. Davison got straight to the point. "This was impressive initiative," he said, glancing at Brenda. "But Ms. Higgins informs me that this kind of work is a significant deviation from your assigned duties." The turning point wasn't one big event. It was a death by 1,000 paper cuts. But the final cut was particularly deep. We were pitching a new data architecture to a major client. I had conceived the entire framework the night before Charles told me. He thought it would be better if David, my male subordinate, led the presentation. The clients are old school, he said. They'll respond better to his delivery. I sat in that meeting watching David present my work, my slides, my words. The clients were impressed. Charles beamed, and something in me just snapped. It wasn't anger anymore. It was a cold, clear certainty. This wasn't my ceiling. This was my cage. And I had the key. I didn't realize I wasn't alone until I started quietly looking. It was in the women's washroom on the 10th floor, where I'd sometimes find Anya, a brilliant developer from another team, just staring into the mirror, taking a deep breath before going back into the fray. We started having coffee. Then it was drinks after work with Anya and a few others. We called it the venting session. But it was more than that. It was intelligence gathering. We shared strategies. We documented every idea, every email timestamp, every instance of credit being stolen. We created our own private ledger of injustice. It was from this sisterhood that the real idea was born, not just to leave, but to build something new, a company where merit was the only currency. We spent months planning in secret, our laptops glowing in quiet corners of cafes, a conspiracy of the underestimated. Securing funding was the first real test of our new reality. We walked into rooms full of men in Patagonia vests who asked us about our 5-year life plan and whether we were prepared for the emotional toll. But we also found a different kind of investor, a few forward-thinking firms, some led by women who saw our diverse team not as a quota to be filled, but as a strategic advantage. They valued our different perspectives, our scrappiness, our insane work ethic born from having something to prove. When the first major check cleared, it wasn't just capital, it was validation. It was someone with power saying, "We believe in you, not in spite of who you are, but because of it." The first year was a blur of pure, unadulterated hustle, but we built our company culture with intention. No bro atmosphere, no tolerating disrespect. We rewarded collaboration over competition, intelligence over arrogance, and it worked. Our product was better because our team was happier, more invested. We started landing clients our old company had chased for years. We were a whisper at first, then a murmur, and then a headline. Industry blogs started profiling us as the disruptive new player, the startup with a soul that was eating the lunch of the legacy giants. I'll never forget the day I saw the article with my picture next to the headline, "The Woman Who Cracked the Code, How a Rejected Analyst is Reshaping FinTech." I wondered if Charles saw it. We heard the rumors, of course, that our old firm was floundering, that their old guard mentality had driven away their best talent, many of whom quietly applied to us. They were losing market share, becoming a relic. I have to admit there was a certain satisfaction in it. But it was bittersweet. It wasn't about schadenfreude. It was about proof that our way wasn't just morally right, it was commercially superior. The email came on a Tuesday. It was from Charles' executive assistant, Charles Williamson, would like to request a meeting to discuss potential synergies. I knew what that meant. They were drowning. And we were the life raft. I forwarded the email to Anya, now my CTO, Her reply was just 3 words: wear a good suit. Brenda jumped in. It's about protocol. We have channels for a reason. You can't just bypass your direct supervisor with hunches. Walking into our own boardroom to greet them was a surreal experience. There were 3 of them, Charles, David, and their stern-faced chairman. They looked uncomfortable, out of place, amidst our bright open-plan office. The power dynamic had completely inverted. I was no longer standing to present. I was sitting at the head of the table waiting for them. Charles' smile was strained. You've built something remarkable here, he began, and I could see the words cost him something. They didn't want a partnership, they wanted a lifeline. Their offer was an acquisition. They would buy our company, and in return we would get a significant payout, and our old jobs back with more seniority. Of course, David avoided my eyes the entire time. I let the proposal hang in the air for a moment. I looked at each of them, these men who had once defined the limits of my world. I thought about all the notes I'd taken, all the ideas I'd had to fight for, all the times I'd been called sweetheart. I leaned forward. Thank you for the offer, I said, my voice perfectly calm. But we're not interested in that structure. I then laid out our terms. We would acquire their company's core assets, the name would be retired, their technical team would be integrated, but their leadership would be offered generous severance packages. And then I outlined the new leadership structure for the combined entity. I would be CEO, Anya would be Chief Technology Officer. Key positions across the board would be filled by the women from my team, the very ones who had been overlooked and sidelined for years. The silence in the room was absolute. The chairman sputtered, That's unprecedented. You're asking us to hand over our company to your staff. I smiled. I am asking you to hand over your company to the most capable leaders available. The market has already decided who they are. This isn't a negotiation about fairness, it's a transaction based on performance, and our performance speaks for itself. I watched Charles deflate. He finally looked at me, and for the first time I saw not patronizing affection, not dismissive disregard, but a kind of weary respect. He knew they had no leverage. They had come to the table from a position of weakness, and we held all the cards. We signed the deal 2 months later. The financial victory was staggering, but it felt almost secondary. The real win happened on the first day of the merger. Walking through the doors of what was once my old office, now under our company's name, with Anya by my side, seeing the faces of the women who had stayed there, the hope in their eyes, we weren't just changing the ownership. We were changing the culture, the very DNA of the place. We were dismantling the invisible walls. One promotion, one respectful conversation, one earned opportunity at a time. The victory wasn't in beating them, it was in building something better and proving that the world they said we had to quietly accept was never the only world possible. This was the moment. The power dynamic was right there, shifting under our feet. I didn't get defensive, I didn't apologize. I just looked at Mr. Davison and said, I understand protocol, sir, but in my position, I have a unique view of the company's historical data. I wasn't acting on a hunch, I was acting on documented procedure that had been misfiled and forgotten. I believed restoring millions of dollars in billing capability was a priority that superseded standard reporting channels. Let the number hang in the air, millions. I saw the calculation in Mr. Davison's eyes. He was weighing my insubordination against the value I'd just delivered, the value no one else had been able to provide. The promotion came through 2 weeks later. It wasn't a small step up, it was a leap. They created a new position for me, Director of Operational Efficiency. My office was on the 5th floor with a window that looked out over the city. The morning I moved in, carrying a single box of my personal things from the mailroom closet, I passed Brenda in the hallway. She forced a smile. Congratulations, she said, but it sounded like a question. I just nodded. Thank you. I'll need your departmental workflow analysis on my desk by Friday. The look on her face was something I will carry with me forever. It wasn't just shock or resentment. It was the dawning realization that the map had been redrawn. She now reported to me. The first meeting with my new team, which included several former senior colleagues, was quiet. You could feel the tension. They were waiting for me to gloat, to wield my new authority like a weapon. But that wasn't the victory I wanted. Revenge is a small, petty thing. I stood at the head of the table and said, this department has a lot of potential. My goal is to clear the obstacles so you can do your best work. I am here to listen. Your ideas matter. I meant it. I was establishing a new culture, one based on merit, on the value you brought, not on the title you held. I'd learned that from the bottom. I knew which obstacles were real and which were just people putting lids on other people. Sometimes I'll be in my office late again, and I'll look out at the city lights. I think about that phrase know your place, they meant it as a limit. But I've come to see it differently. Knowing your place isn't about accepting your position. It's about understanding your foundation, that mailroom, that condescension, that feeling of being boxed in. That was my foundation. It was the solid ground I built on. It taught me every inch of the business from the ground up. It taught me humility, and it taught me resilience. Knowing the real moment, though the one that carved itself into my memory, was my 6-month review with my direct supervisor Brenda. She had a smile that never reached her eyes. She slid the performance form across her desk. Satisfactory, she said, tapping the box checked in the middle of the scale. You're reliable, you show up on time. Then she leaned forward, her voice dropping into a confidential tone that was meant to sound helpful, but felt like a shove. The feedback from the partners is that you should, well, you have a lot. Place means understanding where you come from so you can appreciate the climb, and let me tell you, the view from the boardroom is a lot clearer when you remember what it looked like from the mailroom. I remember the office, the hum of the computers, the endless beige of the cubicle walls. It was a place designed to suck the color right out of you. My job was to create, but every idea I had felt like it had to fit inside a very small, very gray box. I was a graphic designer, supposedly, but my title felt like a lie, more like a digital janitor pushing pixels into pre-approved templates. My boss David had a vocabulary of about 5 phrases. Let's circle back on that. Think outside the box. But within brand guidelines, his favorite was we don't do that here. I'd come in buzzing with an idea, something with energy, with a real visual punch. I'd show him a mock-up, my heart a little bit in my throat, and he'd just stare at it. He'd lean back in his chair, tap his pen on the desk. It's a bit much, he'd say. Can you make it pop a little less? Maybe use the corporate blue. And the font has to be Helvetica, you know the rules. It was soul-crushing. We weren't making art, we were assembling visual sludge. Every project was a process of dilution. Take something vibrant and interesting, and slowly drain all the life from it, until it was safe, sterile, and utterly forgettable. The worst part was the micromanagement. David would stand over my shoulder, pointing at the screen. Move that logo 2 pixels to the left. No, my left. I felt my own creativity, this thing I had always cherished, starting to atrophy. It was like a muscle I wasn't allowed to use. The breaking point was the innovation campaign. The irony of the name wasn't lost on anyone. I had an idea for it, a really bold one. It involved custom illustration, a dynamic layout that broke from the standard grid, a color palette that was actually exciting. I worked on the concept for days, late into the night. It felt like me, it felt true. I presented it to David, and he just frowned. It's not really our voice, he said. It's too artistic. Let's just use the stock photos of people in business suits shaking hands and make the headline synergistic solutions. A week later, we had a big client presentation. David was showing the deck, and I was just sitting there zoning out. Then I saw it on the screen. It was my idea, but it was mangled. He'd taken the core concept, the illustration style I'd proposed, and he'd watered it down. The colors were muted, the layout was clunky, but it was unmistakably mine, and he presented it as his own. What I've developed here, he said, is a fresh approach I am calling visual engagement. I felt my face get hot. The client nodded, looking impressed. I just sat there, my hands clenched under the table. That was it. That was the moment I knew I couldn't stay. My creativity wasn't being discouraged. It was being stolen, repackaged as something bland, and sold off by someone who didn't have an original thought in his head. Enthusiasm. But it's important to know your place. Focus on the tasks in your job description. That's the path to success here. So I started painting again, at night in my tiny apartment with a cheap canvas and some tubes of paint. I'd almost forgotten I owned. It wasn't about clients or guidelines. It was just about making marks, putting color on a surface. Because it felt good. That small act of rebellion, just for me, felt like coming up for air. I started a digital sketchbook. I'd create posters for fictional bands, illustrations for stories I made up in my head. I didn't think anyone would ever see them. It was just my secret sanctuary. On a whim, I created an anonymous online portfolio. I called it Midnight Canvas. I started posting my personal work. They're just a new piece every few days, no explanations, just the art. At first it was just me. But then a comment appeared, then a few likes, then someone shared one of my pieces. A small community started to form, people who responded to the energy, the rawness of it. They'd ask questions. What's your process? What inspired this? It was the exact opposite of the feedback at the office. They weren't asking me to change it, they were asking me to explain it, to share more of it. The follower count was slow, but it was real. It wasn't bots, it was other artists, designers, people who just liked interesting things. I started getting messages. Do you do commission work? I love your style, would you ever consider designing a logo? The first time I got paid for a piece of my own art, my actual style, it was a shock. It was a tiny project, a logo for a local coffee shop. But it felt huge. It was validation, proof that what I did had value outside of that beige prison. The decision to quit wasn't easy. I had rent to pay, id saved up a little cushion that looked terrifyingly small when I thought about relying on it. But one morning, I was putting on the same uncomfortable shoes, getting ready for the same commute, and I just stopped. I looked at myself in the mirror, and I didn't recognize the person staring back. I looked tired, dull. I called in sick. I spent the day working on a commission piece, and it was the most productive, joyful day it had in years. The next, walked into David's office, placed my letter of resignation on his desk. His face was a picture of confusion. But you have a stable job here, he said. Where are you going? I just smiled. I am going to go make things, I said, and I walked out. The first few months of freelancing were lean, scary lean. I lived on rice and beans. I said yes to every tiny project that came my way. But even when I was stressed about money, I was happy. I was working from my kitchen table in my pajamas. But the work was mine. The clients were coming to me for my style, not in spite of it. I wasn't rich, but I was free. Then something shifted. A design blog I followed featured one of my pieces. It was just a small spot, but the traffic to my site went crazy. Then a bigger publication picked it up. An art director from a company I actually admired sent me an email asking if I was available for a project. My phone started buzzing more. The industry was starting to talk. I'd get LinkedIn messages from old colleagues. Saw your work on Behance, looks amazing. There was a tone of surprise in their words, like they couldn't believe the quiet, boxed-in designer from the office was capable of such a thing. Know your place. The words hung in the air, thick and suffocating. They weren't just about hierarchy, they were about ambition. They were a lid. I walked out of that room, my face hot, my hands clenched into fists in my pockets. The anger was a physical thing, a buzzing in my ears. I wanted to quit right then, to walk over to Brenda's desk and tell her exactly what she could do with her satisfactory rating. But I looked around at the gray cubicles, the people with their heads down, and I knew I couldn't. I needed the job. One afternoon my phone rang. I didn't recognize the number, but I answered it professionally. Hello. This is Alex. There was a pause on the other end, a familiar hesitant clearing of the throat. Alex. It's David. David from from Crestline Partners. My blood ran cold for a second, then it turned hot. David, hello. What can I do for you? He sounded flustered. Well, it's about the Apex Global account. You remember them, our biggest client? I remembered. They were the ones who loved his water red on version of my idea. They've seen your online work, the Midnight Canvas portfolio. He said the name like it was a foreign word. They're insistent. They want a complete rebrand for their new product line, and they've made it very clear they only want to work with you. I was silent for a moment, letting the irony sink in. The client that had been presented with my stolen, diluted idea was now demanding the real thing, and they were demanding it from me. David started talking again, his voice tight with panic. We need you, Alex. This account is vital. Name your rate. Whatever it is, well, make it work. This was the moment the power had shifted. It was in my hands. I took a deep breath. My consulting rate is 5 times my old hourly salary. I said, my voice steady. I require a 50% deposit. Before I begin any work, I will own the copyright to all preliminary concepts, and you will have 2 rounds of revisions. Any further changes will be billed at an additional premium. There was a long silence on the other end. I could hear him breathing. That's steep, he finally said. I understand, I replied. The offer stands, let me know. I hung up the phone. My hands were shaking, but it was from exhilaration, not fear. 20 minutes later, my email dinged. It was from David. The subject line was Apex Project Agreement. The body was just one line: we accept your terms. Walking back into that office was a surreal experience. I didn't go to my old cubicle. I was ushered directly into the main conference room. David was there, along with a few other managers I recognized. They looked at me differently. There was a new respect in their eyes mixed with a healthy dose of awkwardness. I was no longer an employee. I was a hired gun, the expert. They explained the problem. The Apex campaign was failing. The visuals were not connecting. They needed something fresh, something disruptive. I listened nodding. I knew exactly what the problem was. It was the same problem they'd had when I worked there, a fear of anything that felt genuine. I laid out my plan. It was bold. It was the kind of thing that would have got me laughed out of the room a year ago now. They just nodded, taking notes. Yes, that sounds disruptive, David said, trying to sound enthusiastic. I delivered the work on time. It was some of the best work I'd ever done. It was vibrant, intelligent, and perfectly captured what the client wanted, but in a way that was entirely unmistakably my style. I didn't compromise. I didn't dilute it. And they loved it. The client was thrilled. David sent me an email full of exclamation points. A massive success. Let's discuss a retainer. But the real satisfaction wasn't in their praise. It was in the process. It was in doing exceptional work on my own terms. I had the control. I had set the boundaries. And I had operated within them with complete professional integrity. I had fixed the very problem they had created by stifling me. The lesson was so clear it was almost blinding. I hadn't fought for a better seat at their table. I hadn't tried to convince them of my worth. I had simply built my own table in a room filled with light and color, and they had eventually been forced to come ask for a place to sit. And that is a kind of success that no corporate job can ever give you. It's the satisfaction of knowing your value and refusing to let anyone else set the price. Needed the paycheck, so I swallowed the anger. I let it sink down from my throat into my stomach, where it hardened into something else, something cold and determined. The first time I walked into the main hall of the university, I felt like I'd wandered into a museum, where I wasn't allowed to touch anything. The air itself was different. It smelled of old books and floor polish, sure. But underneath, that was something else, a kind of quiet arrogance. It was in the portraits of old, grim-faced men lining the oak-paneled walls. And it was in the way the other students carried their leather satchels like they were born to carry them. I was a first-generation student. My background was practical. We fixed things. We worked with our hands. The only heirlooms in my family were tools, not diplomas. I didn't know the right way to talk, the right authors to casually drop into conversation. I was an imposter, and I was sure everyone could see it. My faculty advisor was Professor Alastair Finch. He had a way of looking at you over the top of his spectacles that made you feel about 2 inches tall. I went to him during my second year, buzzing with an idea for my thesis. It was about challenging the established chronology of a particular historical period, suggesting that the conventional timeline was built more on tradition than on concrete evidence. I'd found some discrepancies in primary source documents that everyone else seemed to have glossed over. I laid it all out on his desk, my notes messy but passionate. He listened, or rather, he let me talk, until I ran out of steam. Then he picked up one of my pages between 2 fingers as if it were something slightly dirty and interesting diversion. He said, his voice dry as dust, but not really a suitable focus for a serious academic pursuit. He leaned back in his leather chair. The problem, you see, is one of foundation. The scholars who built this timeline, they had a certain pedigree, a rigorous training that allows for a deeper understanding. You, and here he looked me directly in the eye, you lack that foundation. You're trying to run before you can walk. My advice is to pick a safer topic, something well-trodden. Prove you can operate within the established framework before you try to tear it down. He handed the paper back to me. This field relies on a certain intellectual lineage, a pedigree. It's not something you can simply acquire through enthusiasm. I left his office feeling hollowed out. The worst part was that a part of me believed him, surrounded by peers who'd gone to private schools and had academic parents. I felt like a fraud. My curiosity felt clumsy next to their polished certainty. The feeling of isolation was physical. I'd sit in the library surrounded by hundreds of years of accumulated knowledge and feel completely alone. The laughter from the common room seemed to come from another world, one I'd never be part of. I was on the outside, looking in through a thick pane of glass. For a few months, I tried to follow his advice. I started a paper on a safe, boring topic. But my idea wouldn't leave me alone. It gnawed at me. I realized that if I stayed within the institution's approved path, it'd be slowly sanded down until I fit. So I made a decision. I would do the research anyway, without permission, without support. I dropped the safe topic. I spent every spare moment not in my part-time job in the city archives, not the university library. The archives were a different kind of quiet. It was a productive silence, not an intimidating one. The librarians, they were helpful. They didn't care about my pedigree. They cared that I handled the documents with care. I'd sit for hours in a pool of lamplight, surrounded by crumbling letters, faded shipping manifests, and personal diaries that hadn't been read in a century. That night, sitting in my tiny apartment, I made a decision. If knowing my place meant accepting their low expectations, then I was going to redefine the entire map. This entroval position, this closet of an office, wasn't a cage, it was an observation post. It was the best seat in the house to learn how the company really worked. I started paying attention, not just to the tasks I was given, but to everything. I listened to the secretaries, gossiping about which partner was struggling with a client. I was building my case piece by piece, a date here that didn't match, a witness account that contradicted the official record. It was slow, meticulous work. I wasn't a student during those hours, I was a scholar. I knew I'd never get it published in one of the big traditional journals. The gatekeepers, people like Professor Finch, would never allow it, so I started a blog. It sounded ridiculous at the time, but it was the only platform I had. I began publishing my findings in detailed, carefully cited posts. I reached out to other independent researchers, online scholars, who were also working outside the system. We formed a loose network, arguing, debating, refining each other's work. My reputation started to grow. But it was a reputation based solely on the work. No one knew or cared where I went to school, they only cared about the evidence I presented. I published a series of articles in a small open-access journal run by a collective of historians who were tired of the old guard. It was dismissed by the mainstream as fringe, but it found an audience. Then something started to happen. A well-known historian at a conference in Germany cited my work during a QA session. A documentary filmmaker contacted me for background information. My argument, my little idea, that Professor Finch had dismissed, as a lack of pedigree, began to gain traction. It was no longer just an interesting theory, it was becoming a credible challenge to the established narrative. I started getting emails, invitations to speak at smaller, more specialized conferences. I was always introduced as an independent scholar, which was code for doesn't have a PhD from a fancy university. But the audiences were engaged, they asked tough questions, they treated the work with seriousness. Big invitation came out of the blue, the International Congress of Historical Studies. It was the most prestigious conference in the field, the one where all the big names gathered. They asked me to deliver a keynote address. The theme of that year's conference was re-examining foundations. The irony was almost too much to bear. I remember opening the email and just staring at it for a full 10 minutes. My hands were shaking. They wanted me, the person deemed unfit for a simple thesis, to keynote their flagship event. The day of the conference, the main hall was even more imposing than I remembered. It was packed. I stood at the back before I was due to go on, my heart hammering against my ribs. And that's when I saw him, Professor Alistair Finch. He was sitting in the third row, looking exactly the same, just a little grayer. He was studying the program with a slight frown. I felt a cold wave of panic. Every bit of that old imposter syndrome came rushing back. Who was I to stand up there? He was right, I was an enthusiast, not a scholar. But then I looked down at my notes. They weren't just notes. They were the culmination of years of work. They were the archives, the late nights, the conversations with other researchers who believed in the pursuit of truth over the protection of reputation. I walked to the podium. The lights were bright, and for a moment I was blinded. Then my vision cleared, and I saw the sea of faces. I saw him watching me, his expression unreadable. Noted which departments always seemed to be in crisis mode every quarter. I memorized the organizational chart until I could picture the whole tangled web of reporting structures in my head. I became a student of the company itself. I began to speak. I didn't talk about myself or my journey. I talked about the documents. I laid out the evidence piece by piece, just as I had in that archive. I connected the dots, showing the inconsistencies in the traditional timeline. I presented a new, more nuanced model, one that accounted for all the data, not just the convenient bits. I spoke for 4 to 5 minutes. The room was utterly silent. When I finished, there was a moment of pure stillness. And then the applause started. It wasn't polite applause. It was a wave of sound that felt like a physical force. I had presented my work to the very establishment that had rejected me, and they were listening. After the talk, as people were milling about, I saw him making his way through the crowd toward me. My stomach tightened. He stopped in front of me. He looked older, up close, tired. That was a formidable presentation. He said the words seemed to cost him something. You've assembled a compelling argument. There was a long pause, the noise of the crowd faded into the background. It seems I may have been premature in my assessment of your work. I just nodded, I didn't know what to say. The system, he continued almost to himself. It's designed to maintain continuity, but in doing so it can become rigid, it mistakes tradition for truth. He looked at me, and for the first time there was no condescension in his eyes, only a kind of weary respect. You operated outside the system, you didn't ask for permission perhaps, that was necessary perhaps, that is the only way real paradigm shifts occur. We talked for a few more minutes. It wasn't a friendly conversation, but it was a professional one. He acknowledged the work as he turned to leave. He said one last thing: pedigree is a poor substitute for perseverance. After he was gone, I stood there surrounded by well-wishers and colleagues. I thought about that word meritocracy. We're taught that academia is a meritocracy, that the best ideas rise to the top. But that's not entirely true. The gates are guarded. The definition of best is often controlled by those who have been inside for generations. True meritocracy isn't about rising within a pre-approved system. It's about having the courage to build your own platform if the existing one won't let you in. It's about valuing intellectual courage over conformity. My journey wasn't about proving him wrong. It was about proving to myself that my curiosity had value, that a different perspective, one from outside the ivory tower, was not a weakness but a strength. And I knew, looking out at the young graduate students in the audience, their eyes wide with possibility, that the most important thing my work might do is inspire them to trust their own inconvenient questions, to challenge the gatekeepers, and to do their research with asking for permission. The secret grind started there in those quiet hours after everyone else had gone home. While my friends were out at bars, I was in the public library, checking out books on corporate finance, on marketing strategy, on supply chain logistics. I found old industry reports in the office recycling bin and took them home to study. I spent my weekends taking online courses, teaching myself data analysis software that no one in my department had even heard of. My social life evaporated. My apartment. The first time I walked through the front doors of the company, I was 16. It was summer, and my father believed in earning your keep. The air conditioning was a shock after the humidity outside, a sterile cold breeze that smelled of industrial cleaner and old paper. My oldest brother Mark met me in the lobby. He was already a vice president, already had the corner office with the view of the river. He clapped me on the shoulder. But it wasn't friendly. It was a gesture of ownership. "All right, kiddo," he said, his voice echoing in the marble-lined space-time, "to learn the business from the ground up, and I mean the ground." He wasn't joking. My ground floor was the warehouse annex, a cavernous, dusty place where the filing system hadn't been updated since the 70s. My job was to organize the archives, which was a polite way of saying I was to move boxes of disintegrating paperwork from one rusty shelf to another. No one else down there was family. They were all hourly workers, good people who looked at me with a mixture of pity and curiosity. The son of the founder, covered in dust and spiderwebs, Mark would swing by, sometimes usually with a client in tow, to check on the project. He'd gesture at the towering stacks of boxes and say with a laugh, "This is the future right here," getting his hands dirty. The client would always chuckle politely, "Id just keep stacking boxes." That was the pattern for years. Even after I graduated, I got a business degree, came back full of ideas about digital workflows, cloud-based inventory, targeted social media marketing. I'd bring them up at Sunday dinners, trying to sound casual. If we scanned the contents of those boxes, I sorted, we could access any client file in seconds from any office in the building. My sister-in-law Carol would pat my hand, "That's sweet, Alex, but our clients appreciate the personal touch. They don't want to be just a number in a computer." Mark would lean back in his chair. "The system works. We've been profitable for 40 years. With that system, stick to what you know, kid." What I knew was consistently whatever no one else wanted to do. I was the troubleshooting liaison for our most difficult accounts, the ones the senior account managers had given up on. I was sent to the trade shows. No one else wanted to attend in cities. No one wanted to visit. I was never included in the quarterly strategy meetings, even though my name was on the door. My office was a glorified closet next to the break room. They called me the kid. It was a joke. But it wasn't. It was a label. Way of keeping me in my place. I was just the founder's son, the beneficiary of nepotism, who needed to be tolerated, not heard. The revolution didn't start with a bang. It started with a spreadsheet. I'd finally been given a small team to manage a group of junior analysts who were like me mostly ignored by the upper echelons. Our department was customer analytics, which meant we compiled reports that were promptly filed away and forgotten. But we had access to all the data, and the data was telling a terrifying story. Our core customer base was aging out. We weren't acquiring new younger clients, our brand was becoming synonymous with your father's company. We were bleeding market share slowly, but surely to nimbler digital-native competitors.